Look at your hand right now. Whatever color it was not always that color. Not your hand specifically. Your species. For almost the entire story of humankind, every single person on Earth had dark skin. Everyone. Then something happened. Something slow, something brutal, something written into your DNA before you were even a thought. And the real answer is far stranger than a suntan. You have probably heard the simple version. People moved to cold places. The sun got weaker, skin got lighter. Done. Except that is not really an explanation. That is a description. It tells you what happened without telling you why your body would bother changing something as fundamental as its own armor. Skin is not decoration. Skin is a shield, and shields do not change for no reason. So let's go back. Not centuries, not even thousands of years. Millions. Around 2 million years ago, your ancestors lost most of their body hair. This is one of the strangest evolutionary events in the human story, and researchers still debate exactly why it happened. But most agree it had something to do with heat regulation. Early hominins living on the open savannas of East Africa needed to walk long distances, chase prey, and cool down efficiently under a brutal sun. A body covered in thick fur cannot sweat effectively. So the fur thinned. And underneath that fur was skin that had never once been exposed to direct, relentless equatorial sunlight. Think about what that actually meant for a moment. A hominin walking across the East African savanna 2 million years ago was not wearing clothing. There was no shade to speak of for long stretches of open grassland. There was no sunscreen, no hat, no shelter waiting at the end of the day. Only relentless equatorial sun beating down on newly bare skin, hour after hour, for an entire lifetime. That is an extraordinary amount of exposure, repeated across every single generation, with no relief in sight. Whatever adaptation came next had to be powerful enough to counter that. Here is where it gets serious. Bare skin under the equatorial sun is not a cosmetic problem. It is a survival problem. Ultraviolet radiation does not just cause sunburn. It penetrates the skin and attacks something deep inside your body's chemistry, folate. Folate, also known as vitamin B9, is essential for making new cells. It is critical for cell division, for healthy sperm production, and most urgently for the development of a fetus during early pregnancy. Low folate levels in a pregnant woman are strongly linked to devastating birth defects, including neural tube defects that can be fatal within weeks of conception, often before a woman even knows she is pregnant. In other words, folate is not a minor nutrient tucked away in a multivitamin. It is close to non-negotiable for successful reproduction. And ultraviolet radiation destroys it. Laboratory studies have shown that intense sun exposure can break down folate circulating in the bloodstream within a matter of hours. For early hominins losing their fur under the African sun, this was not a small inconvenience. It was a direct threat to reproduction itself, generation after generation. Evolution does not care about comfort. It cares about which bodies successfully pass on their genes. Bodies that could not protect their folate levels struggled to do exactly that, and their lineages quietly thinned out over time. This is where melanin enters the story. Melanin is the pigment responsible for skin color. It is produced by specialized cells called melanocytes, and it functions like a natural, built-in sunscreen. Darker skin contains more eumelanin, a form of melanin that is especially effective at absorbing and scattering ultraviolet radiation before it can reach the deeper layers of tissue where folate circulates. In other words, dark skin was not a random trait, and it was not chosen for appearance. It was a biological necessity, forged under pressure. The hominins whose skin produced more melanin were protected. Their folate stayed intact. Their pregnancies were safer. And over countless generations, that trait spread through the population, not because anyone found it beautiful, but because it worked. It is worth pausing here to notice how elegant this trade-off actually was, biologically speaking. Melanin did not need to block all sunlight to do its job. It only needed to filter out enough of the harmful wavelengths to keep folate levels stable without shutting down every biological process that depends on the sun. Under the intense, near-vertical sunlight found close to the equator, there was more than enough ultraviolet radiation reaching the ground for the body to strike that balance comfortably. Skin could be dark, folate could stay protected, and there was still plenty of sunlight left over to handle whatever else the body needed from it. The system worked because the environment itself was generous with light. By the time modern Homo sapiens emerged in Africa, somewhere around 300,000 years ago, dark skin was not an option among many. It was the baseline. It was the human default, the factory setting for the entire species. Every person on this planet, regardless of what they look like today, descends from ancestors with dark skin. Every single one. So then what changed? Here is the twist. Around 70,000 years ago, give or take a few tens of thousands, some groups of humans began migrating out of Africa. They pushed north, into the Middle East, into Europe, into Central and Northern Asia, into places with weaker sunlight, shorter winter days, and long stretches of gray sky. And here, the very trait that had saved their ancestors' lives began quietly working against them. Because melanin is a double-edged shield. Yes, it blocks harmful ultraviolet radiation. But UV radiation is not purely destructive to the human body. Your skin also uses a narrow slice of it to manufacture something else you absolutely require: vitamin D. When sunlight touches your skin, specifically a band of ultraviolet B radiation, it triggers a chemical reaction that converts a compound just beneath the surface into vitamin D3. This vitamin is essential for absorbing calcium, for building strong bones, for regulating your immune system, and for a long list of processes your body has no easy substitute for. In a place like equatorial Africa, sunlight is so intense and so constant, nearly year-round, that even heavily melanated skin still lets in enough ultraviolet light to produce sufficient vitamin D. There is a surplus of sunlight to work with, so the shield can stay thick. But move that same dark skin north, into a place like Scandinavia, where winters bring weak, low-angle sunlight for months on end, and the math falls apart completely. Dark, melanin-rich skin filters out so much ultraviolet radiation that in weak northern sun, it may not let in enough to produce adequate vitamin D at all, no matter how many hours a person spends outside. And a body starved of vitamin D over months and years develops a condition called rickets. Bones soften. Legs bow. Growth becomes distorted. In women, a deformed pelvis caused by childhood rickets can make childbirth dangerous, sometimes fatal, for both mother and infant. So now you have two competing pressures, pulling in opposite directions depending entirely on where a population happened to live. In strong equatorial sun, dark skin protects folate. Pregnancies proceed safely, and life continues. In weak northern sun, that same dark skin can quietly starve the body of vitamin D, threatening bone strength and reproduction in an entirely different way. Evolution had built a shield perfectly tuned for one battlefield, and then some humans walked straight into a different one with a different enemy, and the old armor no longer fit. Imagine a small band of humans, thousands of years into this migration, settling somewhere near the Baltic coast as the seasons turn. Summer offers a brief window of usable sunlight. Then autumn arrives, and the days shorten fast, and by midwinter the sun barely climbs above the horizon at all, weak and pale even at noon. A child born into that band, with skin calibrated for the equator thousands of kilometers to the south, would spend most of the year producing almost no vitamin D at all, no matter how much time it spent outdoors. Multiply that single child across dozens of generations, across hundreds of family lines, and you begin to see the shape of the pressure evolution was responding to. It was not abstract. It was measured in bent bones, difficult births, and children who did not survive to pass anything on at all. The body adapted, but not overnight. Populations that migrated into low UV regions of Europe and Asia gradually evolved lighter skin, reducing melanin production just enough to let in more of the scarce sunlight needed for vitamin D synthesis, while still retaining some protection against the worst of UV damage. This was not a single, dramatic mutation appearing in one generation. It was a slow statistical shift, favoring individuals whose skin happened to let in a little more light, generation after generation, in places where the sun could never quite be relied upon. Researchers Nina Jablonski and George Chaplin, working at Pennsylvania State University, mapped this relationship with remarkable precision by studying skin reflectance data from populations across the globe. What they found was almost like a gradient painted directly onto the human body by the sun itself. The closer to the equator a population's ancestors lived, the darker the average skin tone. The farther from it, the lighter. Not because of preference, not because of culture, because of two vitamins locked in a chemical tug of war with the sky above them. The genetics back this up in a way that is almost humbling. Geneticists have identified specific genes, including one called SLC24A5, carrying a variant strongly associated with lighter skin in European populations. Studies of ancient DNA suggest this particular variant became common in Europe relatively recently in evolutionary terms, potentially spreading within roughly the last 6 to 12,000 years, favored because it offered a genuine survival advantage in low sunlight environments. Fair skin in Europe, in other words, is a remarkably recent development. Far more recent than agriculture. Far more recent than the earliest cities. Your idea of what a typical human looks like in any one region today is often just a snapshot of a story still being written, frozen at this particular moment in a much longer process. Here is something else that tends to surprise people. Lighter skin did not evolve just once, in a single lineage, spreading outward like one continuous wave across the continents. Genetic evidence suggests that light skin evolved independently, more than once, in different populations that migrated separately into low UV regions. European populations and East Asian populations, for example, appear to have evolved lighter skin through partly different genetic pathways, involving different genes reaching similar outcomes. Evolution, in this case, did not find one clever trick and copy it everywhere. It solved the same problem more than once, using different tools, because the pressure to solve it was that strong, wherever humans wandered into weak sunlight. This is the counterintuitive part worth sitting with for a moment. Skin color, one of the traits humans have used for centuries to draw the sharpest lines between one another, to build entire systems of hierarchy and prejudice on top of, is in evolutionary terms almost embarrassingly simple. It is not a marker of intelligence. It is not a marker of character or ability or worth. It is a chemical compromise between two vitamins, calibrated by latitude, adjusting to whatever amount of sunlight a population's ancestors happened to live under for enough thousands of years. The deepest biological truth about skin color is almost anticlimactic when you say it plainly. It is sunscreen tuned by geography. And that tuning is still visible today, in a pattern that maps with startling accuracy onto a globe. Populations near the equator across Central Africa, southern India, and parts of the Pacific tend to carry darker skin, evolved under intense, near-constant ultraviolet radiation. Populations at higher latitudes, across Scandinavia and northern Europe, carry some of the lightest skin on the planet, calibrated for regions where usable sunlight is often scarce for half the year. And in between, across an enormous range of human populations, a whole spectrum of intermediate skin tones exists, each one reflecting ancestral latitude, migration history, diet, and how long a population's ancestors spent adapting to the specific quality of light in the place they eventually called home. There is one more wrinkle in this pattern that makes the whole picture even more interesting. Diet matters too. Populations that traditionally relied heavily on fish and marine mammals, such as certain Arctic populations, obtain large amounts of vitamin D directly from their food, from fatty fish and animal fat rich in the vitamin. Because their diet was already supplying what their skin might otherwise have struggled to produce in such a dark, sun-starved environment, some of these populations retain noticeably darker skin than other groups living at similarly high latitudes who depended more on agriculture. In other words, skin color was never responding to sunlight alone. It was responding to the entire survival strategy of a population, sunlight and food working together as two different routes to the exact same vitamin. There is also a quieter irony hiding inside this story, one that connects directly to your life today. The two vitamins at the center of this entire evolutionary tug of war, folate and vitamin D, are things you can now buy in a bottle at any pharmacy without a second thought. Prenatal vitamins routinely include folic acid specifically because doctors understand how critical it is during early pregnancy, the exact same nutrient that quietly shaped human skin tone hundreds of thousands of years ago. Vitamin D supplements sit on shelves everywhere, especially popular in northern countries with long, gray winters, quietly compensating for a shortage of sunlight that your ancestors once solved with pigment instead of pills. You are, in a very real sense, still fighting the same two-front battle your ancestors fought. You have just outsourced part of it to a supplement aisle. And there is a modern mirror here that goes even further than that. Today, people cross latitudes in hours instead of generations. A person whose skin evolved for the intense, constant sun of equatorial Africa might now live in cloudy northern Europe, a genuine risk of vitamin D deficiency because their biology has not had nearly enough time to catch up to their new address. A person whose skin evolved for the weak, scattered sun of Scandinavia might now live near the equator, at real risk of sun damage and folate breakdown because their biology was calibrated for an entirely different sky decades or centuries ago. Evolution moves across thousands of years. Airplanes move in a matter of hours. Your skin, quite literally, has not caught up to the speed of your life, and understanding that is not a minor curiosity. It carries real, practical consequences for health, still playing out in bodies alive right now, in every city on Earth. Doctors have noticed this mismatch directly. Studies across multiple countries have found notably higher rates of vitamin D deficiency among darker-skinned individuals living at higher latitudes, particularly during winter months when sunlight is weakest. At the same time, lighter-skinned individuals who spend extended time under intense equatorial sun face elevated risks of skin damage and skin cancer, a modern echo of the same ancient trade-off, just inverted. Neither pattern is a flaw. Neither is a mistake. Both are the visible fingerprints of an adaptation still catching up to a species that now moves far faster than evolution ever anticipated it would. It is a strange thought to sit with. The single-trait humans have spent so much of recorded history obsessing over, sorting each other by, building assumptions around, turns out to be one of the most recently and rapidly shifting traits in the entire human genome, still actively adjusting, still a work in progress, still just sunlight and vitamins negotiating a truce across thousands of generations. So the next time you look at your own skin or notice the different skin tones of the people around you on a train, in a classroom, in a photograph, you are not looking at a hierarchy. You are not looking at anything designed, ranked, or decided in advance. You're looking at a live map of ancient sunlight, drawn generation by generation onto human bodies as they wandered farther and farther from the equator, each shade a negotiated settlement between two vitamins your ancestors could not survive without, worked out over hundreds of thousands of years, one birth at a time. Look at your hand again. It carries a memory older than language, older than agriculture, older than every border ever drawn on a map. Every shade of human skin is the same story, told at a different latitude.